And market. Thank you. And brain.
王赓武's mission in life has been to chronicle the global experience of Chinese migrants. It's one he knows well, having arrived in Australia from Malaysia in 1968 to become Professor of Far Eastern History at the Australian National University. Does home have to be a country or a city? Or is home this house or that? We have been fortunate. We seemed always to have been home, he famously recounted. From his time at ANU to becoming Vice-Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong before then joining the National University of Singapore, Professor Wang's groundbreaking research has helped shape concepts of identity and belonging, two such themes that resonate widely with many Chinese Australians. The王赓武Lecture aims to shine a light on their achievements and significant contribution to Australian life.
Good evening. My name is Jennifer Wong, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the王赓武Lecture, an initiative of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations in partnership with the ABC. Tonight, we're acknowledging the substantial and long-standing contributions of Chinese Australians to Australian life. We're here to celebrate our diverse Chinese Australian communities, and it's our hope that over time this lecture will grow so that we can continue to discuss what it means to be Chinese Australian today. Tonight, we're lucky to be surrounded by these enchanting illustrations created by our keynote speaker, Gabrielle Wan. But before Gabrielle tells us the stories that will bring these characters to life, I'd like to invite Uncle Michael West to welcome us to country.
Bojadi Gamarua Gadigal Liora. G'day and welcome to Gadigal land. I was thinking we're still in the Lunar New Year, and it's so important to celebrate all the different cultures that we have. And I can see the little rabbit over there. Is that the rabbit? Yes. And it is the year of the rabbit. I myself am tiger myself. Yes. I won't tell you how many of those tiger years. So it's so important, and it's great coming together. And Chinese culture is a rich culture, and coming together with Aboriginal people and Australian culture is so important. Here, there is a long history that goes back with China. And I'm not sure if everyone knows here. I'm sure a lot of people do here, but not out there. When you think about it, there's up the top up there was sea cucumber trade that happened for more 400 or 500 years, yes, with the Macassans up through Indonesia and up through China. Also, this is evidenced too by, if you look at, when you get a chance, Google Vatican hunting bird manuscript. And what you will see a cockatoo in there. And it goes back to 1241, almost 800 years. So obviously there was trade amongst ourselves for more than 65,000 years, but trade up through Asia and into Europe. It's quite amazing, isn't it? We've had a couple of tough years. We've still got a little bit way to go through this pandemic, and it's important that we do take a moment's silence to pay respects to our ancestors, and all cultures pay respect to our ancestors, because one day we will become ancestors. It's also important to pay respects to those we've lost the last few years, because they're not just numbers. Remember, they are names. They have faces, they had their own dreams and aspirations, and we need to remember them. They're part of families and communities. And we need to reflect our journey right here and the journey of these two cultures coming together, Australian and Chinese. And also, it's important that we do centre ourselves, because we do have very busy lives, don't we? Yes. So if we have a moment to pay respects and a moment of reflection, and also pay respects to country, because our mother has supplied us with everything, and she has been speaking a little loud of lately, hasn't she? Yes. She wants us to respect her, and we need to care for her because she cares for us. So just a moment of reflection, a moment of silence. Thank you. Water falls from heaven, lands on our mother, finds its ways to the rivers and the ocean. We have the Hawkesbury, Nepean and Georges. These are the aquatic boundaries of our nation. To any of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters in here today or out there, we warmly welcome you from country, from clan, from tribe, from nation. To all our brothers and sisters, and we are all brothers and sisters, aren't we? We belong to that one mob, one tribe humanity. It's not always respected, as we can see on TV, but we can show the rest of the world when we do respect each other, we create an inclusive society, respect diversity, no matter who you are, whatever postcode you were born in, and no matter what colour your skin is or your eyes or your hair, it should not matter. You should be able to fulfil your dreams and aspirations in this society. So let's show the rest of the world when we do treat each other with respect and dignity, we can create a wonderful society. So on behalf of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, our members, our elders, we welcome here, continue the good work of sharing these stories, as we say, yarning, and always was, always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded. And let's show the world, as I said, when we walk together and we care for each other and we have some important conversations coming up, no doubt, over the next year or so. Let's show the world what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Michael, for welcoming us to country. I'd now like to invite the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, to deliver a welcome address via video.
Good evening. Tonight we celebrate the contributions of Chinese Australians and the rich diversity of modern Australia. As you will know, tonight's lecture is named after eminent historian of overseas Chinese communities, Professor Wang Wu. Professor Wang and his family's path has been similar to my own. Origins in China, life in Malaysia and settling in Australia. Professor Wang travelled from Malaysia to Australia in the 1960s to teach at the Australian National University. And he played a key role in making ANU one of the leading global centres of China studies. At the same time, my dad came from Malaysia to study in Australia on a Colombo Plan scholarship. Australia has undergone profound change since then, when my parents first met. We have worked to become a thriving, inclusive society, one that celebrates its diversity and the strength this gives us. This modern Australian identity is an asset, an element of our national power that few countries can match. For over 200 years, Chinese Australians have made enduring contributions to Australian life. This has included people like paediatrician Dr. John Yu, AC, who gave the inaugural Wang Wu lecture last year, the heart surgeon and Australian of the century, the late Dr. Victor Chang, AC, and Elizabeth Chong, AM, who has brought Chinese cuisine to Australian audiences for over half a century. Even lesser-known contributions, like those of the late Dr. Zhou Jian, co-inventor of the HPV vaccine whilst at the University of Queensland, which has saved the lives of countless women. Today, more than 1 million Australians claim Chinese heritage. Australia is a better and stronger nation because of this. So I can think of few better speakers than Gabrielle Wan, a fourth-generation Chinese-Australian writer and illustrator and Australian Children's Laureate for 2022 and 2023, to help us celebrate their contribution tonight. Gabrielle's writing uses Chinese characters and stories to bring more diversity to Australian children's literature, and her works have shown a generation of young readers who we are, what we value, and what we are made of. Her story, like mine, like Professor Wang's and like many of yours, are part of the story of Australia. Finally, thank you to the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations and to the ABC for hosting this important event and giving a platform for these stories.
Thank you, Minister Wong. Before I introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Gabrielle Wan, I'd like to share some observations with you from my experience travelling around the country as the presenter of Chopsticks or Fork, the 6-part ABC series about Chinese restaurants in regional Australia, which is soon to be a book. For the last few years, my collaborator Lin Ji Kong and I have been on the road to every Australian state and territory, spending time with families who run Chinese restaurants and meeting the locals who simply can't get enough of lemon chicken and sizzling Mongolian lamb. At every restaurant we visit, we try their sweet and sour pork and deep fried ice cream. You're right, it is a tough job. We've sat at tables with lazy Susans and drank hot cups of tea with restaurant owners, couples from Hong Kong, Guangdong, East Timor, Vietnam, from Moree to Hervey Bay, and from Horsham to Dunsborough. Each of these families have Chinese identities we rarely see mentioned in Australian media. The family from Guangdong identifies as Toi San. The family from East Timor identifies as Hakka and continues to speak the language. The family from Vietnam is Chiu Zhao, and if you call the day before you arrive, they'll cook you up a Chiu Zhao feast of fried tofu and soy sauce braised duck. The term Chinese is a broad brushstroke term that holds more than 1 billion people and their identities in its grasp. When we use the term Chinese Australian, that tells another story yet again and asks so many more questions. When did your family come to Australia? Why did they come? Where were you born? When did you start to feel a sense of belonging in this country? Do you feel this now? Why? Why not? These are the questions we've asked on Chopsticks or Fork, and the answers reveal hundreds of singular stories about hopes and fears, and survival and endurance told through both tears and laughter. I mentioned this tonight not to inspire you to have sweet and sour pork for dinner, although that might happen, but to gently introduce the idea that these moments of exchange where we do talk about one's sense of belonging are not common. But what if they were? Chinese Australian sense of welcome in this country has changed throughout time. Throughout this flux, one thing remains certain in recent years, and that's the sense of belonging that can come from seeing yourself represented in books and on screen. We need to insist that, for our good health, stories told from different perspectives by a variety of voices are vital to our well-being. Which brings me to introduce you to our keynote speaker tonight, Gabrielle Wan. Gabrielle is an author, illustrator, and the Australian Children's Laureate for 2022 and 2023. Gabrielle was born and raised in Melbourne and is 5th-generation Australian. Her father came from Shanghai, and her great-grandfather on her mother's side came to Victoria during the gold rush in 1853, when he was 18 years old. Gabrielle's stories are a blend of Chinese and Western culture with a touch of fantasy. She's written more than 20 books for young readers, with many of them shortlisted for awards, from the Prime Minister's Award to Children's Choice Awards, such as the Yabba and Koala Awards. One of Gabrielle's most popular books, A Ghost in My Suitcase, won the 2009 Aurealis Award and was turned into a stage play by Barking Gecko Theatre in 2018. Her latest book, a delightful read, is Zadie Ma and the Dog Who Chased the Moon. Please give a warm welcome to Gabrielle Wan.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for those lovely words and introduction. It's really lovely to be here today. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the land's first storytellers and artists, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I recall going to a lecture given by Professor Wanggung Wu way back in the 1970s at Melbourne University. So I have known of his reputation as a preeminent scholar on Chinese history for quite some time. I'm therefore indeed honoured to be guest speaker here today. I'd like to begin with reading from my very first book, The Garden of Empress Cassia, published in 2002. It's often said that one's first book is semi-autobiographical, so this is certainly the case with my book. And so I'll just read. The main character, the protagonist, is Mimi, and this is the first chapter. Her dad is a Chinese herbal doctor, and she lives in a shop with her parents. So this is the first chapter. I've abridged the first chapter just to make it shorter. Mimi Lu lived in a two-storey shop that seemed to float on a cloud of strange smells. She was embarrassed enough that her home stank like a compost heap on a hot day, but the odour seeped into everything, her clothes, her pigtails, her skin, and could even be detected on her breath. Her parents forced her to drink all kinds of disgusting brews. The only way to get them down was to hold her nose until the very last swallow. At school, she was called Smelly Lou. Kids complained if they were asked to share a desk. She never told her mum or dad about the bullying. They wouldn't understand. "Remember, Mimi, you're Chinese. Be proud of it." The words rattled around inside her brain. They were empty words that didn't belong to her. How can I be proud? They speak English with a funny accent that makes them sound really dumb, and other kids live in a proper house with grass and garden. All I have is the footpath out on the street. "Why are you late today?" Dr. Lu wiped the counter with a feather duster, then walked through the red curtains. "I told you already, Dad. Miss Odell is giving me special art classes after school. She says I have real talent." Mimi hadn't made a big deal of it. She knew her dad would be angry. "You need to concentrate on schoolwork, not painting," he said, suddenly breaking into Chinese. He did this whenever he was serious or angry. Painting is not a respected profession. "But I love drawing and painting, Dad," she replied in English. 2 years ago, Mimi had decided never to speak Chinese again. "I'm Australian, not Chinese," she had said defiantly. She knew it made her parents angry, but it was the one thing in her life she had control over. Her dad waved his hand towards the yellowing photograph hanging above the altar table in the hallway and frowned at her. "Your Nai and Gung Gung are watching, waiting for you to honour the family name." "Oh, phooey," Mimi said softly, then looked up, hoping the ancestors were hard of hearing. She felt the disapproving stare of her grandmother and grandfather on their ancestral cloud. "Isn't burning incense every day enough for you? Don't you know that other kids' parents say, 'Well done, you did your best'? They're always being told how great they are. I get 98 for a maths test, and Dad says it's not good enough. All he ever does is criticise. Tell your teacher you are busy after school. No more wasting time." Mimi's dad broke into her thoughts. "But Dad, that's not fair," she replied angrily. Dr. Lu sat down at his desk, his back blocking the conversation. It was no use. He had shut her out as usual. Mimi had learnt long ago that Chinese children never argue with their parents. She stared at her maths book as tears melted the black digits into blurry grey blobs. Why did I have to be born into a Chinese family? So as Jennifer said, I've been a children's author and illustrator for 22 years, and in March last year I was awarded the role of Australian Children's Laureate. There are currently, let me tell you a bit about laureates, there are currently children's laureates in the US, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Mexico, Sweden, Finland, Italy, Wales and Australia, each of us with a 2-year term. And during my 2 years, I'm visiting every state and territory in Australia, speaking on the things that I'm passionate about with the theme, Imagine a Story. Now, dragons are so tightly woven into the fabric of Chinese culture. They have played a big part in my life. So one of the first things I did as laureate was to paint this friendly, book-loving dragon for all the posters and bookmarks. The four main topics that I talk about in my travels are imagination and how we need to keep it strong through reading, writing, and drawing. After all, everything that's been man-made has been imagined first. And the best thing about this superpower that humans have, all humans have, is that it's free. But imagination is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it grows. And conversely, the less you use it, the weaker it grows. So I encourage everybody to use your imaginations. The second point that I talk about in my travels is the crucial role of diversity in children's literature, which I'll come back to in a moment. Number 3, the importance of art and drawing all the way through primary school into adulthood. Every toddler can draw and has the confidence to do so, but something happens when children go to school. Perhaps it's because art and drawing, they're not considered important in our society and are confined to the art room. But drawing enables a child's imagination to become more active. To draw is to see and understand. For example, if you draw something from nature, like a leaf or a beetle or a tree, your understanding of that object will deepen on many levels, including your understanding of nature. I encourage you all to give it a go. In my workshops as I travel around Australia, every child does an interactive dragon drawing with me. I also encourage the teachers and parents to take part. Many are surprised at what they create, especially those who have already made up their minds, and some of you probably have already made up your minds too, that you're bad at art. But practice is the key to becoming good at, or not good necessarily, but better at anything. I also talk about the vital role school libraries play in a child's development. How school libraries are the perfect places for all children to have access to a huge range of stories well beyond what is provided at home. And that there are amazing teacher librarians who can encourage children to explore stories they might not have picked themselves. For me, the teacher librarian is like a mentor. They can hand-pick a book for an individual student, and we all need mentors in our lives. Late last year, I received an email which moved me to tears. It relates to the invaluable contribution teacher librarians and school libraries make and the importance of diverse books and representation. I asked the young sender if I could share her words, and she enthusiastically agreed. Let me read them to you. Hi, I'm 16, so way older than the demographic that you're usually contacted by. I just remembered how important your books were to me as a fellow Chinese-Australian kid who got bullied for that heritage. My teacher librarian introduced them to me at just the right time. Reading about characters that looked like me was so important to me growing up, and I just wanted to thank you for that. Because of you and your characters and your stories, I knew it wasn't bad to be Chinese in the hardest of times, and that our culture is beautiful. I loved Ghost in My Suitcase, The Pearl of Tiger Bay, The Garden of Empress Cassia, and the Pearly Australian Girl books very much as a kid, and I still do. I reread them to this day. Sincerely, Rachel, a fellow Chinese-Australian girl. Unfortunately, more and more state primary schools are closing down their libraries and are no longer employing teacher librarians. So if you have primary-aged children, please support your local school library, for a library, in my opinion, is the beating heart of a school. We must never underestimate the value of quality, diverse books to shape the minds of children, as not only do they assist with instilling empathy, but also can help give children a sense of belonging and self-worth. A middle grade is the age group I like to write for. These books are for readers from around the age of 8 to 13, which are the years of growing self-awareness and learning about one's relationship with the wider world. I feel that if a child gets hooked on reading at this young age, then they will be readers for life. Well, that's my hope anyway. When I was 8 years old, Enid Blyton's Faraway Tree books were my favourite, and I'm sure in the audience and out there, Enid, you'd probably say the same thing. And when I talk to schools, the kids still love Enid Blyton. Her books, Magic Faraway Tree books, were the inspiration to write in the genre that I do, which I call magic realism. These are stories set in the real world, but they travel into otherworldly realms. All my novels contain elements of Chinese culture, philosophy, and mythology to varying degrees. And underlying most of my work is the philosophy of Taoism. In the late 1960s, I remember seeing a Chinese gentleman in the park performing a succession of beautiful, graceful movements. I spent months trying to find out what it was and where I could learn it. You probably have guessed already, but in those days, few people in Australia had heard of Tai Chi. I found a teacher called Rocky, and this led me to Taoism, which succinctly put is the philosophy of following nature. Now I feel very fortunate to have this deep well of Chinese culture, history, and philosophy to draw upon in my life and my stories, even if I'm just touching the surface. Being an ABC, an Australian-born Chinese, that's all I can do. But I didn't always feel proud of my heritage. I remember from around the age of 10, my greatest wish back then was to be white, like my best friend, Wendy. I felt like a white girl trapped inside a Chinese girl's body. My brothers and sister and I, we couldn't speak Chinese as our parents spoke different dialects. My father, David Wang Huan, was born on Chongming Island near Shanghai and spoke Mandarin and Shanghainese. And my mother, Mabel Wong, spoke Xinhui dialect of Cantonese, so their common language was English. Mum had to teach Dad how to speak English when he first came to Melbourne during the Second World War. Here's a photo of them in their days of courting, which was a forbidden relationship, by the way. Her parents absolutely forbade her. And my story, Little Paradise, is about my mum's love story with my father, and it mentions all that in there. And it's set in Melbourne during the 1940s and then crosses over to Shanghai. And that's Mum on the front cover. From an actual photo taken by the very well-known fashion and portrait photographer Athol Smith. The black and white photo was hand-coloured, as was very common in those days. Because Mum was also born in Australia, as was her father, she was equally as ignorant as we were about Chinese customs. It was also important in those days for migrant families to fit into the Australian way of life the best they could. I was deeply ashamed of my parents, especially if they came to school. There were very few Chinese families in Melbourne, as most of the men who came to Australia for the gold rush returned to China when gold petered out. I had not one Chinese or Asian friend, not because I didn't want one, but because I never met any. I was the only Asian face at my school, so it wasn't any wonder that I saw myself as white. In jest, we'd refer to ourselves as bananas. That's someone who was white on the inside and yellow on the outside. I felt Australian, sounded Australian, but was consistently reminded that I didn't look Australian. There was also a great deal of racial prejudice. Even as a young child, I'd walk down the street, and I grew up in those wonderful days where you could just, as a 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old, could walk by yourselves down the street without any helicopter parenting. And drivers would wind down their windows and yell racial slurs at me, telling me to go home. But Australia was my home. We had originally thought all along that my great-grandfather was the first family member to come to Australia from China to look for gold in 1853. So what a discovery it was to find that his father came out as a labourer in the 1830s. It wasn't until a passage from the See Up Society's Annals, one of the early Chinese societies of Melbourne, was translated into English a few months ago, that our family found this out. From there, we know nothing more about him. It was his son who was sent to Australia when he was 18, as Jennifer mentioned, to look for gold. He was known as Jimmy Chen RQ. He later became a pioneer of Waganya, a paddle steamer port on the Murray River opposite Corowa. What is wonderful is that Josh Reid, the principal of Waganya Primary School, recently changed the 3 house names to reflect the town's local history. They are now dedicated to the 3 most influential historical figures of Waganya, and one is Chen House, after my great-grandfather Jimmy Chen RQ, and of course the colour is red. Ford House, after John Ford, who founded Waganya, and McRae House, after the well-known Aboriginal artist Tommy McRae, who lived in Waganya at that time. And here are some of Tommy McRae's wonderful works of art. I just love his paintings so much. He is one of my heroes. And so I think that the more people who see his wonderful work, also they're an incredible historical record of those times. Just imagine if all schools in Australia reflected such diversity. This is a photo of my great-grandmother with her children taken in 1901 in Melbourne, just before she took them to China. They're all born in Australia. My great-grandmother's marriage to my great-grandfather was arranged, as was the custom in those days. He was in his mid-50s and she in her early 20s when she travelled from Guangdong to Victoria to wed. The boy on the left is my grandfather, and his brother. He and his brother attended Waganya Primary School. The Poppy books, which are a part of the Our Australian Girl books published by Penguin, are set during the Victorian Gold Rush and were inspired by my great-grandfather, Jimmy RQ. It's set in 1864, and Poppy is an orphan both of Chinese and Aboriginal descent. I believe that all cultures should be reflected in Australian children's literature. As a children's author and illustrator, I hope to encourage young people to read books by diverse authors about diverse characters and lifestyles. Walking in another's shoes, seeing through their eyes, feeling their emotions, their fears and joys, only a book has the power to do that. All through my school days, I wanted to be an artist, so when I left school, I studied graphic design. I worked as a graphic designer for a number of years, but I was still struggling with my Chineseness. I found that in order to accept myself, I needed to embrace the culture behind who I was. So in 1979, I went to Taiwan to study Chinese language and painting. I'd only intended to go for the summer break, but I loved it so much I stayed for 5 years. After a year in the US, I then went to live in Nanjing to study Chinese painting, followed by a year in Hangzhou, where I studied at the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Art, now known as the China Academy of Art. I returned to Australia no longer feeling like a white girl trapped inside a Chinese girl's body. For the first time, I was proud of my Chinese heritage and realised that having more than one culture was so wonderfully enriching. Now I can choose which culture I want to be at any given time and can transition from speaking English to Chinese with relative ease. It's a common story among those from migrant families. Ironically, I am now grateful to all those racist bigots who called me names when I was growing up. If they hadn't, I know for certain I wouldn't be a children's author today. Unlike most writers who have had a passion for writing since they were really little, my passion only came about in adulthood. The emotions I felt as a child became the motivation for me to express through my novels all my feelings about culture, equality, and humanity. So from bad things, good things can grow. Unfortunately, there is still a long way to go in Australia. During lockdown, I did some online workshops with a school where 90% of the children in the class were of Asian background. And yet, I was told by the teachers that most of them were ashamed of their heritage. This shocked me. I was the only Asian face in my whole school, so it wasn't any wonder that I felt like an ugly duckling. But how is this possible in 2021 in a school where the majority of kids are Asian? Well, COVID has played a big part in this anti-Asian sentiment. Indeed, racism towards Chinese has been around since the gold rush, and it comes in waves. So COVID is, really no surprise. I believe stories about diversity can help those who are the victims of racism and bullying, as shown in Rachel's email. They can also open up young minds to new ways of seeing the world. I hope by sharing stories that are a celebration of all our differences, children may find a feeling of self-acceptance from a young age. I encourage those from diverse backgrounds to share your stories too. Don't think that your words don't have value. The more diverse stories there are out in the open, the more tolerant our society will be. I was a very late starter to writing, as I mentioned earlier. Traditional learning was not for me, and I failed year 12. I wanted to be an artist and loved drawing so much. So I repeated the year as I needed the qualification to study graphic design at RMIT. I worked as a graphic designer for a number of years until I went to live in Taiwan and China. At the same time, I was interested in writing and illustrating picture books, but I had no luck when I submitted manuscripts. Then in 1999, when my children were in primary school, I had a strange and prophetic dream about, you guessed it, a dragon. The next morning, I wrote the dream down, and over the course of a day, it grew into a short story. I was surprised at myself because I thought I couldn't write, but I didn't know what to do with the story, so I put it away in a bottom drawer. The following year, I decided to get serious about publishing a picture book. So I took a TAFE subject, writing for children. In the first semester, we worked on picture books, which was great. Then in second semester, we were to start a children's novel. I only wanted to learn about picture books, so I didn't intend to go back. But in one of those rare moments that can change your life forever, I forced myself to step out of my comfort zone, something I have done many times since, because it's the only way one can grow. In the class, I worked on the story that came out of my dream, and by the end of the year, I had the first draft of The Garden of Empress Cassia. It took around 6 rejections before it was finally picked up by Penguin and published in 2002. And I'm happy to say that it's still in print today. Among the many themes in my novels, which include belonging, identity, family, and creativity, is the theme of hidden potential. Many of us don't discover who we truly are or what we are meant to do until much later than others, which is perfectly okay. Sometimes it takes that long to find one's potential, and when we do, it can turn out to be exactly the right time in our lives. Writing novels instead of picture books has become the primary focus of my career. But I do include black and white spot illustrations in all my novels, and even more so in my latest novel, Zadie Ma and the Dog Who Chased the Moon, which came out last year. It's different from any of my other novels because, as well as an overall narrative around the main character, Zadie, it also has short fable-like stories and graphic novel sections, so it's the most challenging novel I've had to write to date. Set in Melbourne in 1955, Zadie longs for a dog of her own. She has a special talent, though, a superpower. The superpower is that some of the stories she writes come true. So she begins to write a story about a dog called Jupiter. In this book, I explore themes of friendship, war, culture, racism, courage, hope, and connectedness, and of course, love. But above all, it is a story about empathy and belonging. There are 11 short stories throughout the book, supposedly written by Zadie Ma, and the graphic novel sections are from the point of view of the dog Jupiter. I also love to paint for pleasure. So over my 2-year term as Children's Laureate, I've elected to visit many regional areas to talk to children, as they don't have the same opportunities as city kids do to hear a children's author and illustrator. And one of the highlights of being laureate will be an international children's summit at Bologna in Italy at the Bologna Children's Book Fair in March. It's the biggest children's book fair in the world, held in the beautiful medieval university town of Bologna. I've been to the fair twice before, but it will be fantastic meeting other children's laureates from all around the world, sharing our themes and projects together. But I would have to say, one of my career highlights is really sitting on the Play School set with little Ted on my lap, which I did here last year in the ABC studios, right in this spot. I was able to choose any one of the Play School toys, but I chose little Ted because he's been my hero since my children were little. He was balding in places, so I had to hold him very, very gently. So I'd like to finish with one of the stories from Zadie Ma and the Dog Who Chased the Moon. This story is called The Rose and the Well, a story by Zadie Ma. There was once a rose bush that grew beside an old well. The well had been the centre of everyday life in the small village for centuries, until a town was built close by and all the people moved. In the town, water came to their homes in pipes, then out through a tap. The old well was sitting forlornly, looking up at the grey sky, when a rose nodded her head over the well's wall. "Why are you so sad?" she said. "They built me so long ago, and now they have abandoned me. My walls are crumbling, and moss covers my insides. I am old, not beautiful like you. Your beauty lies in your depth, in the way you are connected to the underground spring. Look inside yourself. Go on." The well had never thought of doing this before. He had always looked up and out. "I'll give it a try," he said, and he looked into himself, right down into the cool earth from where his waters sprang. "Do you see?" the rose said. "My beauty is fleeting. Your beauty lies in your crumbling walls and moss-covered insides, and especially in your timeless age. You have seen many things, whereas I have only seen a season." "I suppose you are right," said the well. "I have seen the villagers attacked by bandits. I have seen them help the sick and wounded. I have seen their births and deaths, their joys. I have seen the hardships humans face." The rose bowed her head. "I have only seen the full moon a few times, and soon my petals will wilt, then fall." The well looked alarmed. He'd just found a friend, someone who understood and appreciated him, and he was about to lose her. "Don't worry," said the rose. "Your waters keep my roots alive, and each summer I will bloom again and again, and you can tell me stories of all that you have seen." It is hard to believe that such a pair could ever fall in love, but they did. The walls of the old well crumbled, but its insides, although covered with moss, stayed pure. And as promised, the rose bloomed every year. Walkers, if they were paying attention, could sometimes hear soft murmurings coming from the old well, telling the rose stories of all they had heard and all that he had seen. Thank you very much. 恭喜发财. Happy New Year, everybody, too.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. You've given us so much to think about when it comes to the contributions of Chinese Australians to Australia and the impact that's been made over time. Through your work as an author and illustrator, you make it possible for young Australians, especially Chinese Australians, to see themselves and their families feature in stories where anything is possible. Your books and the characters you bring to life are an enduring source of comfort and inspiration, and a reminder of the diversity of Chinese Australian stories. On behalf of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations and the ABC, thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you for joining us for the 2023 Wangang Wu Lecture.